again, NotJah Witness here, and now for something completely different. The other day, I was reached out to by a barely known YouTuber that goes by the name of Suris, some strange Robin Hood cross Thor guy who carries a massive hammer. Compensating, for sure. He asked if I would help his struggling YouTube career by joining him for his next video, and of course I obliged him. We gotta help out the little guys, you know. So this is a mirror of Suris's video where he takes on some arguments for heaven and hell, as originally given by some believers and spoken by fellow atheist YouTubers and the like. This was a lot of fun to be a part of, so if you somehow actually haven't heard of Suris yet, I would strongly advise you to give his channel a look. He has some of the best productions coming from our humble group, so get.
So I need to address this Christian apologist paper that was written, since part of it pertains to me. Also, the video might be a bit long since there's so much to respond to. So let's go ahead and roll the intro. A few weeks back, I filmed a segment for a video on the Non-sequitur show, where atheists ask questions for Christians to answer, instead of the common trope of having atheists answer questions that theists posit. My question went as follows. So, in most sections of Christian theology, there's typically one of two afterlives you'll get into when you die. There might be different subsects of this, but generally speaking there are these main two ones, heaven or hell. So my question would be, why would you want either of those? Let me lay it out. You can either go to heaven and have no free will, or you can go to hell and burn forever. Take your pick. If you go to heaven, everything's happy at all times, which means you're not allowed to feel sadness. You'll be worshiping God until the end of days, and there's going to be no end of days, so it's going to keep going forever and ever, which means you effectively have no will of your own. You are forced to worship this deity until who knows when. Now, if you go to hell, then you're going to be burning forever, but at least you have your free will. In neither of these are you given a choice or a chance to be anything but what you will be shaped and molded into. In both of these, you will effectively be a slave, whether you have your free will and you're burning and tortured, or you have no free will and thus are effectively stuck in unending servitude. I don't believe either of these places exist, and I have no reason to believe either of these places exist, but it seems that a lot of Christian theists want these places to exist, and my question would have to be, why? Both of them sound absolutely abysmal. Well, let's take a look at the answers to this question and see how they stack up. I'd like to personally thank Inane Dragon, Raziel the Panda, and NotJah Witness for providing their voices for the document at hand. I had already taken a lot of time recording my lines, and honestly the prospect of reading theirs, well, it was a little daunting, so thanks for the help, guys.
There's more to unpack in this question than I really have time for today, but I think it's a very fundamental question in understanding our relationship to God. It's one of the areas I have the hardest time reconciling the traditional Christian view of, and for me personally, it's one of the most treasured parts of the LDS faith that I know of. Paul speaks of seeing a man caught up into the third heaven, and Christ talks about the fact that in his Father's house are many mansions. The word mansions can also be translated into kingdoms. Paul also speaks of different degrees of glory of resurrected bodies. Looking just at the biblical evidence even then, it suggests to me that there are more than just two destinations for the inhabitants of this world after this life, and that God's justice will ensure that each person will receive a place that is right for them to be, and in a state that they will be happy, with the exception of the absolutely most evil, who must be bound and cast out again because justice demands it.
So, Scott Adams' answer seems to come across, to me at least, as a massive dodge of the question. The entire point of my question is to point out that at its most fundamental levels, Christianity has either a good or a bad afterlife. One where you worship, and one where you burn. To simply state that, nuh-uh, my religion has more heavens and bad people don't get heavens. It's adding semantics onto a question that really has nothing to do with those semantics. It has to do with the fundamentals. Also, the entire free will portion of the argument was glossed over, so I'll chalk this up to being a non-answer.
First of all, Orthodox Christian eschatology is far more complex than death. Then you go one of two places after death. Generally, Christians acknowledge that those who repose, that is dead, exist in something of a waiting room, what the Hebrews called Abraham's bosom. This may be pleasant, what's called the beatific vision, painful, the rich man in the parable of Christ about Lazarus, or active, the intermediate state, sometimes called purgatory, after which, at the general resurrection, we will have a second life. The damned will be tossed into the lake of fire, and the saints, that is all Christians, including those who only learned of Christianity after death, live out the beatific vision. Heaven has no free will is nonsense. In heaven, that is, the new earth, is the only place where we will truly have free will. To have free will means to have a will that is not impeded by error, vice, or sickness, all of which will be conquered. To worship God has more resemblance to a wife worshiping her newlywed husband who worships her in return than it does some additional duty. There will be no force involved. The fires of hell are what the intense presence of God is when you don't want God's presence around you. Your will is not free, and you are entirely enslaved by your own passions and sufferings. Both of these places are metaphysical places. It's better to think of them as modes of being. Today, your life will be one of these places. Every suffering will become a victory for those in heaven, and every pleasure will become an additional sting of hurt for those in hell. Why do these modes of being exist? Because we are made in God's image, and also have free will. We were made to be with God, which is what heaven is. But we are free to reject that, which is what hell is.
So Andrew uses the same technique as Scott, avoiding the point of the question with the "nuh-uh, my religion has more afterlives than two" part. So we'll go ahead and move past that because he actually tries to address the free will argument. He says that heaven has no free will is nonsense, but doesn't even define why. He just says that free will only exists in heaven. He also states that free will means that you aren't impeded by error, vice, or sickness. That's very incorrect. The ability to be in error is, in and of itself, part of free will. Sickness isn't part of free will at all. It's simply an impediment that comes with being an organic life form. It has nothing to do with the free will argument. Vice also doesn't really factor into the equation. It's an influencing factor on your actions, yes, but they ultimately are not a determining factor in the free will argument in its simplest form. What Andrew seems to be referring to are influencing factors on our lives as we know them, but free will itself isn't understood in this answer at all. The fires of hell are what the intense presence of God is, seems to be just one person's interpretation of hell. And honestly, it seems to be an effort to add semantics into an argument about fundamentals. This one doesn't get a pass, since even though it tried to address the free will question, it did it very poorly.
Why would you want to feel sadness? And why is being happy with God for all eternity a bad thing? Going to heaven is an act of free will, and you will continue to do what you want as long as it's good. Going to hell is prideful and being a slave to yourself and to your desires and feelings. The worst people go to hell, which means they'll get punished if they don't get punished here. For heaven, the just are rewarded, especially if they aren't treated well here.
Albert Oehn seems to not only not understand what free will is, but he seems to posit that choosing heaven over hell is an exercise in free will. But by saying that you'll continue to do what you want as long as it's good in heaven is only adding a caveat to what you will be compelled to do. And by adding that caveat, you've officially revoked free will from the individual. The ability to do bad things, make the wrong choices, that's an inherent part of free will. That's what makes it free. Also, saying that going to hell is prideful is a total cop-out. If only the worst people go to hell, why would someone who does only good works go to hell for just not believing in God? We have very different definitions of the worst people. Ergo, this answer also gets a fail.
Firstly, we have free will in heaven. Lucifer freely chose to value his pride and ego over the Lord, as detailed in Ezekiel. Secondly, it seems that one of atheists' biggest issues relates to their contempt for obedience and servility to God. When Jesus cried out in the Garden of Gethsemane and asked our Father to take his cup, he gave us a perfect example of obedience as he knew the task he needed to complete. Jesus took up his cross, as we all have crosses to bear, and must take up our crosses as well. But before people protest this, let me point to the way God glorified Jesus. The meek truly do inherit the world. Through his example, we can all be redeemed. Some of the most amazing people in this world have overcome extreme tragedies and have gone on to make the world a far better place than it ever would have been if we were in some sort of God's pet sanctuary without any challenges. Character building occurs when we're challenged. We can never truly understand love without witnessing hatred. We can never understand the value of perseverance if we never had to persevere. Had we not had examples in life of those who've overcome amazing odds, we'd have no one to whom we can aspire. Consider Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and Harriet Tubman, and the trials and tribulations that they overcame before God glorified them. These people are amazing examples of our heroes. For good reason. Our heroes aren't the people sitting on the sidelines, the armchair warriors on Twitter, some of us included. Our heroes are people who've battled and defeated the most extreme forces of evil in this world. God has empowered them to be examples to all of us, and by learning from their examples, we're better people.
S.J. Thomason also says that we have free will in heaven, because Lucifer freely chose to value himself over the Lord. That's fair, I guess, but then she decides to strawman atheists and say that our biggest issue is that we don't want to obey and serve God. This is as convincing to me as the "y'all just want to sin" argument. And I'm not an atheist because I don't like obeying God. I'm an atheist because I'm not convinced he even exists. Prove he exists first, and then we can talk about fealty. Then, SJ gets into an argument about how bearing a cross, or hardship, is required for character building. Sure, I can agree with that, but if you're willing to open up that can of worms, let me state that by that logic, God has no character at all. He never had hardships and has never been challenged. He's an omnipotent, omnipresent being who by definition cannot suffer hardship. But considering that her God wiped out thousands of innocent infants in a global flood, I can honestly see how having a god with no character makes a lot of sense. Before you say that concepts that apply to earthly beings don't apply to heavenly ones in the same way, she began by asserting that Lucifer was an apt comparison to humans in heaven, so I'd posit that her arguments apply to God in the exact same way. This answer didn't necessarily give a satisfactory answer to anything, so I'm gonna go ahead and give it a fail, since all the examples it gave are just unrelated to the question at hand.
I think it might be helpful to begin the exploration of the ideas of heaven and hell by framing them as metaphors for the future. In this case, heaven would be whatever future is actually true, best, rational, developing, healthy, positive, alive, fulfilled and significant. In this case, hell would be whatever future is in reality miserable, erroneous, ill, irrational, false, worst, negative, empty, and insignificant. We don't aim for the ideal, called heaven from a religious orientation. The likelihood of walking a path of deep, personal, and real meaning is less likely. If we're aiming at something petty, bitter, selfish, false, or meaningless, then we will suffer the hellish consequences inevitably. Free will provides the opportunity to be wrong and to investigate and know for ourselves. When we're aware of the dangers of failure, negligence, and maliciousness, then it highlights and amplifies the meaning of success, caretaking, and heroism.
Abraham's holy terror seems to want to interpret heaven and hell as metaphors and posits that free will is how we choose one path or the other. But alas, it doesn't make an attempt at truly answering the question. It just changes the definition of heaven, not unlike the earlier I have more heavens argument. So this one's a solid fail.
This challenge contains some major presumptions that I need to address. First, it assumes that in the afterlife our consciousness operates the same way as it does in the natural. Here on Earth, our biology rules our minds. We get bored easily. Our moods are determined by whether we're tired, thirsty, hungry, etc. In heaven, we don't have to worry about those things. The consciousness lives forever and is unshackled by the needs of our physical bodies. The afterlife is a metaphysical realm that our minds can't fully process or comprehend while here on Earth. The idea of spending eternity worshipping a deity sounds boring, but it isn't quite like that in the cosmic realm. I've read or heard several testimonies from people who have either had a vision of Jesus, died temporarily on Earth and spent a few minutes in heaven, had both. Interestingly enough, there's a real consistency to these accounts. When I saw Jesus, I wanted to cling to him and never let go. I saw colors you can't see here on Earth. There are flowers and plants that don't exist here. I heard music so beautiful, it was overwhelming. Even though I realized I was dead, it was so wonderful that never wanted to come back. One man was even disappointed when he came back to this world and was never satisfied with it again. He spent the rest of his life yearning to die so he could go back. While the questioner decries the lack of free will, personally, I don't believe that heaven is necessarily going to be all worshipping God all the time. Oh, much of it will be, don't worry about that. But God will reward our curiosity. For the scientifically minded, it's going to be a wonderful experience, learning all there is to know about our universe as He teaches us His mysteries and secrets. Doesn't that sound like bliss? Personally, I think that when we're in heaven, we'll be in a state of constant learning and expanding our intellectual horizons. No matter how much we learn about Jesus, we'll never know all there is to know about him. It's not that we've lost our free will in heaven, it's that there comes a point where free will is no longer needed. We've already made our choice. Those who wanted heaven got it, and those who wanted no part of God got their wish. It makes no sense to say that someone in eternal bliss will change their mind and say, you know, I'd rather be in hell right now.
Philip at least answers the free will issue with a somewhat compelling argument that consciousness will operate differently once we're unshackled from our biological meat sack bodies. I can accept that consciousness will operate differently once biological needs are no longer imposed, but that opens up another issue entirely. Why should I even believe that consciousness transcends the human body? We are complex individuals, and consciousness as we know it isn't fully understood. But what we do have are some pretty compelling examples that consciousness is not only bound to our biology, but it is our biology. Split-brain patients who have left and right hemispheres of the brain separated have been shown to develop completely different personalities in many cases. In some cases, one side is a theist and the other side develops into being an atheist, with one side actively rebelling against the other. Did we somehow get two consciousnesses in this example? It seems to me to be a pretty compelling example of the fact that there is no transcending ghost in the machine, as it were. The machine is simply all there is. Then, Philip gives examples of near-death experiences. We have NDE studies that show that there's clearly chemical reactions going on in the brain during these experiences. Philip states that we have consistency with these accounts. We actually don't. If you only look at Christian NDEs, they seem to match up alright in most cases. But Hindu and Islamic NDEs seem to also have them meeting up with their specific deities as well. So by this logic, they must also be true, but they can't be. So this argument is bad. Finally, he addresses free will by stating that it's not that we lose free will in heaven, it's that free will is no longer needed and we've already made our choices. I don't know if he gets that by stating those very words, he is clearly stating that our free will has been revoked. I didn't ask whether your free will is going to be needed in the afterlife. I said that we wouldn't have it in the Christian worldview. And Philip seems to agree with me on this point. I'm not convinced by his examples of near-death experiences, and his argument about not needing free will sounds like every cult leader I've heard in movies, books, and video games. So his reason as to why is a bit repugnant in my world. He did at least address the free will argument, Somewhat, but I still can't consider this anything but a fail.
I would like to begin my answer with first addressing Suris's rhetorical question, why would you want either of those? The idea of heaven and hell ultimately deals with the issue of crime, punishment, and justice. Skeptics and atheists regularly question whether God exists at all because he appears so absent in the world and passive to the evils that are done on a daily basis. However, when they question God's involvement in finally judging good and evil, they then come out complaining how horrible both of these realities he's set up supposedly are. Well, which is it? Is he a passive and uncaring deist, or is he an overly cruel judge? I would say that he is neither of these options, and the understanding of heaven and hell described by Suris needs development from its simple Sunday school level of theology. Our modern-day culture is sadly cheapened with the philosophies of heaven and hell. It was originally understood that hell is a place of punishment and separation from the source of life, while heaven is a place of bliss and communion with God. This doesn't emotionally sit well with many in the West today because we are so comfortable, and the thought of an eternal punishment comes across as something for only bad people, if they deserve that at all. And yet, we never assume that we may be the ones just as much in need of punishment, or a savior from those punishments for that matter. Think of it this way. If someone has seriously violated you or a loved one so severely and gotten away with it in this life and are unrepentant before Christ, wouldn't it be a crime to allow that man never to be punished and to let them walk the streets of heaven? That would be wrong, because God himself would have made the light of the evil done against you. Justice needs to be served. Regarding the comment, you have no free will of your own in heaven, you are forced to worship this deity until who knows when, and if you go to hell, you're going to be burning forever, but at least you have your free will. The error here is in how free will works. The choice of either heaven or hell is already given to us if we choose to accept Jesus or not. God does love everyone and takes no delight in the death of the wicked, but he will not force you into a situation you do not want. To do so would make him no better than the pagan gods who enslaved humanity. Some people may so hate God and want nothing to do with him, and being in heaven would be hell for them. We are given the choice of where we go. I will make one last quick comment on this. There have been some Christian groups that have used the threat of hell as an apologetic. This has turned out to be a disaster for many people, and it has warped their vision of God into some cruel, angry being who's coming to get you. When a Christian talks about hell, it should be done as a fireman's sincere warning to someone in a burning house. If you don't get out of this place now, the house will burn up and you will die. You do not want them out of spite to answer, I know you're kind. How dare you try to force your beliefs on me and into a way of seeing the world? Go away with your warnings. Keep them.
Robert is equivocating hard here. The issue isn't that we can only choose God being absent or judging us at the end. The issue would be that a God who is absent shouldn't even have the right to judge. We aren't objects, we're people. We aren't some deity's playthings, and to think that we are is naive at best and disgusting at worst. He then gets into an appeal to emotions about whether or not I would want someone who violated me or a loved one to be punished for their actions. The problem is that I think they should be punished, but that the punishment should fit the crime, and eternal damnation cannot logically fit any crime. I addressed this in my Is Hell a Threat video. Next, Robert poses that free will is the choice to either go to heaven or hell, and while on a basic fundamental level that may be true, I'd like to point something out that I failed to mention in my Is Hell a Threat video. Ultimatums aren't truly choices. A choice is do this or that. An ultimatum is do this or else. Hell, as part of a choice dichotomy, is the beating stick of a carrot and a stick ultimatum. This doesn't answer the free will question at all. It deals with free will on earth, not the free will I talked about in heaven. Finally, Robert says that the hell doctrine being used as an apologetic is a problem. And to that, I agree. But unfortunately, it's part of the doctrine whether it's actively used or not. Again, I addressed this in my hell video. Robert sounds like a bad salesperson trying to say, just don't talk about the bad stuff, especially considering that hell is hardly the only bad stuff in the Bible. I can just look at the biblical stance on rape, slavery, and basic human worth, and I can find plenty to call God cruel without even having to go close to the hell doctrine. It's just the ace in the hole. So that's the end of the answers. What did you guys think of them? Please let me know in the comments section below. Personally, I'm not impressed. I think that this question was dodged pretty soundly in most cases, and non-answers were given in most as well. I think this is because legitimately answering this question not only requires a better understanding of free will, I mean, hell, I'm a layperson and basically an idiot of the subject, and even I can point out the flaws in these arguments, but the real meat of the issue is that to legitimately answer the question would definitely be a challenge to faith. Doing anything other than dodging this question would challenge faith way too much, but again, that's just my opinion. What do you guys think? That said, if you liked the video, please give it a like and subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks to all my patrons who help this channel grow, and a special thanks to Andrew Fedoric, I sincerely hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, for being my first $20 patron. We'll start off with a special slide dedicated to you for being freaking awesome. And as always, insert end of video tagline here.